When Beckett Avery first laid eyes on Rose Brennan standing in his doorway with three dusty children clutching her worn skirts, he never imagined that by sunrise, those same children would be calling him Daddy, like he'd been theirs all along. Autumn wind cut through the Montana territory like a blade, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and distant snow. Beckett stood on his porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, watching the horizon where purple mountains met in endless sky. At 32, he'd grown accustomed to the silence that filled his ranch, a silence that had followed him like a shadow ever since his wife Sarah's death 3 years prior. His own boy, Weston, barely 8 years old, had stopped asking when Mama was coming home. The child's laughter had grown thin as mountain air, and Beckett often caught him staring out the same window where Sarah used to brush her golden hair each morning. The ranch thrived under Beckett's steady hand. Cattle healthy, crops abundant. But the house felt hollow as an old church bell. That's when he first saw the dust cloud rising from the eastern trail. The wagon that emerged from the heat shimmer moved slow and deliberate, like a funeral procession. Beckett set down his coffee and stepped into the yard, his boots crunching on dried leaves. As the wagon drew closer, he could make out the driver, a woman with auburn hair escaping from a faded bonnet, her spine straight despite what looked like bone-deep exhaustion. Three children huddled in the wagon bed like baby birds in a nest. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 10, held an infant close to her chest. A boy who couldn't have been more than 5 pressed against her side, his thumb working anxiously at his mouth. The woman, Rose, he'd learn later, pulled the horses to a stop 20 feet from his porch. Her green eyes met his across the distance, and Beckett felt something shift inside his chest, like a door creaking open after being barred for too long. "Mister," she called, her voice carrying the musical lilt of the Irish hills. "I'm sorry to trouble you, but we've been traveling for nigh on 2 weeks, and the children." She gestured helplessly at the wagon. "They need rest, and I was wondering if you might spare some water for the horses." Beckett approached slowly, the way he might approach a spooked mare. Up close, he could see the deep circles under her eyes, the way her dress had been mended and mended again. But there was steel in her bearing, the kind that came from weathering storms that would break lesser souls. "Name's Beckett Avery," he said, tipping his hat. "And you're welcome to more than water, ma'am. Looks like you've had a hard journey." "Rose Brennan," she replied, and something in the way she said it, firm but fragile, told him there was no mister to speak of anymore. "These are my children. Palmer here is 10, Emery's 5, and little Whitman is just 8 months." The baby had started to fuss, and Rose's arms trembled slightly as she adjusted him. Beckett noticed how Palmer's young face had already taken on the worried cast of someone forced to grow up too fast, how Emery's wide eyes darted between his mother and this strange man as if calculating whether to run or fight. "Where you headed?" Beckett asked. "West," Rose said simply. "There's supposed to be work in the mining camps, and She lifted her chin. "I can cook and clean and mend. I'm not afraid of hard work." Beckett thought of those mining camps, rough places where decent women were as rare as spring rain, where children grew up fast and hard, if they grew up at all. He thought of his own Weston, eating supper alone while Beckett worked late in the barn, of the empty rooms upstairs that echoed with memory. "It's near sundown," he said. "Why don't you and the children come inside? I've got stew on the stove and clean beds to spare. We can talk about your journey come morning." Rose's eyes filled with something that might have been tears, but her voice stayed steady. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose." "No imposition," Beckett interrupted gently. "Just neighbors helping neighbors." As they gathered around his kitchen table, Rose spooning stew into the children's bowls with careful efficiency, Palmer bouncing baby Whitman on her knee, Emery chattering excitedly about the horses in the pasture, Beckett felt the hollow spaces in his house beginning to fill with something warm and alive. Weston, usually shy around strangers, emerged from his room drawn by the unfamiliar sound of children's laughter. Within minutes, he and Emery were thick as thieves, planning adventures in the hayloft. But it was when Rose tucked the children into the guest room beds, her voice soft as she sang an old Irish lullaby, that Beckett understood the true ache of loneliness. He stood in the doorway, watching her gentle hands smooth blankets, listening to her whispered good nights. "Sleep well?" My darlings, she murmured. Tomorrow we'll, Mama. Palmer interrupted, her voice small in the darkness. Do we have to leave tomorrow? Rose's hand stilled on the child's forehead. Well, I like it here, Emery added. And Weston said he'd show me the baby calves. And Mr. Beckett has kind eyes, Palmer whispered. Like Daddy used to. Beckett's throat tightened. He turned to leave, to give them privacy, but Rose's voice stopped him. Mr. Avery, she called softly. Might I have a word? They stepped into the hallway, and in the lamplight, Beckett could see the war being fought behind her eyes. Pride against desperation, hope against fear. My husband died of fever last spring, she said quietly. The bank took our farm, and I don't know what I'm doing. I only know I have to keep them safe. You're doing fine, Beckett said. Am I? Rose's voice cracked. Because right now, I'm thinking about accepting help from a stranger, and I don't know if that makes me grateful or foolish. Before Beckett could answer, a small voice drifted from the bedroom. Mama, can Mr. Beckett be our daddy? He makes good stew. Rose's eyes widened, but it was Emery's sleepy addition that made Beckett's heart stop. Yeah, Mama. I already told him good night like he was daddy. And that's when they heard it. Little Whitman's babbling from his makeshift crib, and, clear as a church bell, the baby's first attempts at speech. Did-a. Rose stared at Beckett, her face pale in the lamplight. They've never, not since their father, but from the darkened bedroom came Palmer's whispered confession. I prayed for a daddy tonight, Mama. Do you think God sent us Mr. Beckett? The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, and Beckett realized that whatever Rose decided in the next heartbeat would change all their lives forever. The morning sun painted the kitchen golden as Rose stood at Beckett's stove, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over the cast iron skillet. She'd risen before dawn, unable to sleep, and had found herself cooking breakfast for 6 as naturally as breathing. The smell of bacon and fresh biscuits filled the air, and for a moment, she could almost pretend this was her kitchen, her life, her family. Mama, look. Emery burst through the back door, Weston close behind, both boys' faces flushed with excitement. Mr. Beckett showed us the new foal, and she's got spots like freckles. And he said maybe we could help name her, Weston added, his voice lighter than it had been in months. If we're still here tomorrow. Rose felt Beckett's eyes on her. From the doorway, he'd been watching her all morning with a quiet intensity that made her stomach flutter like a girl's. She'd caught him studying the way she moved through his space, how she automatically reached for Palmer when the baby fussed, how she'd braided Emery's hair without him even asking. About tomorrow, Rose began, turning to face him. I've been thinking, I have a proposition, Beckett interrupted, stepping into the kitchen. He wore his Sunday shirt, she noticed, his dark hair still damp from washing. Hear me out before you say no. Palmer looked up from where she was feeding Whitman. Tiny pieces of biscuit. Are you going to ask Mama to marry you, Mr. Beckett? Because Emery said that's what men do when they want ladies to stay. Palmer. Rose's cheeks flamed. Well, he did say it. Palmer replied with the devastating honesty of childhood. And he also said you're prettier than the sunset, and that you make the house smell like home. Beckett cleared his throat, his own face reddening. What I was going to say is that I could use help around here. The house needs a woman's touch, and Weston needs, well, he needs what your children have brought to this place. Rose set down her spatula, her hands trembling slightly. Mr. Avery, I appreciate your kindness, but I won't accept charity. Not charity, Beckett said firmly. Work. Real work. I'll pay you fair wages for cooking, cleaning, tending the vegetable garden. And the children would have a roof over their heads, good food, proper schooling come winter. And what about my reputation? Rose asked quietly. A widow living alone with a bachelor? People will talk. People always talk, Beckett replied. Question is whether you care more about their tongues or your children's futures. From the yard came the sound of horses approaching at a hard gallop. Beckett's expression darkened as he peered out the window. Speaking of tongues, Chase Nolan dismounted his sorrel, gelding with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle. Behind him rode Athena Booker, the banker's daughter, her riding habit immaculate despite the morning's heat. Rose had heard about Chase from the women at the general store in town, a successful rancher who'd been courting Athena for the better part of 2 years. Morning, Beckett, Chase called as he approached the porch. His eyes moved from Rose to the children gathered around the table, his smile sharp as a blade. Heard you had visitors. News travels fast, Beckett replied evenly. Small territory, Chase said, tipping his hat to Rose. Ma'am, I'm Chase Nolan, and this is Miss Athena Booker. We own the spread to the south. Rose nodded politely, acutely aware of her worn dress and flour-dusted apron. Athena's gaze swept over her with the practiced assessment of a woman marking her territory. How lovely, Athena said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. Though I must say, Beckett, it's rather unusual for a man to take in strays without proper arrangements. Arrangements? Rose's spine stiffened. Well, you understand. Athena continued, her pale eyes cold. A woman of uncertain background, traveling alone with children. One does worry about the influence on impressionable young minds. Palmer's face crumpled, and Rose felt her protective instincts flare like a struck match. My background is perfectly respectable, Miss Booker. My husband died of fever, and I'm traveling west to start over. There's nothing uncertain about grief or survival. Of course not, Athena replied smoothly. I simply meant that a woman in your situation might be tempted to use her feminine wiles to secure a comfortable arrangement. Men can be so easily fooled by a pretty face and a sob story. The kitchen fell silent except for Baby Whitman's contented babbling. Rose felt her face burn, but before she could speak, Beckett stepped forward. That's enough, Athena, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Mrs. Brennan is a guest in my home, and I won't have her insulted under my roof. Oh, Beckett, Athena laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm simply looking out for your best interests. After all, you've been alone so long, you might not see the convenience of this arrangement. What arrangement would that be? Beckett asked. Chase cleared his throat. What Athena is trying to say is that it might be better for everyone if the widow continued on her way. I hear there's work in the mining camps, and the territorial judge won't look kindly on unmarried folks living in sin. Sin? Rose's voice cracked like a whip. I'm working for honest wages, sleeping in a guest room with my children, and harming no one. What sin is there in that? The sin of temptation, Athena said primly. A man and woman living in the same house, unmarried. It's scandalous. Then maybe, came a small voice from the table, they should get married. Everyone turned to stare at Palmer, who was looking at the adults with the practical wisdom of a child who'd grown up too fast. I mean, Palmer continued, if it's about being married, then they could get married. Problem solved. Palmer, Rose whispered, mortified. But it makes sense, Mama, Emery chimed in. We already call him Daddy, and he likes us, and you smile more when he's around. Even Weston nodded enthusiastically. And then we'd be a real family, and Palmer could teach me to braid hair, and we could all help with the full. Rose looked at Beckett, who was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The kitchen felt too small, too full of watching eyes and unspoken possibilities. Children, she said faintly, that's not how. People don't just. Actually, Beckett said slowly, it might not be such a bad idea. The silence that followed was deafening. Rose felt the world tilt on its axis, and she gripped the edge of the table for support. Beckett, Athena gasped, you can't be serious. Why not? He asked, his eyes never leaving Rose's face. We're both adults, both parents, both in need of partnership. It would solve the reputation problem, give the children stability, and what? Rose whispered. Beckett stepped closer, his voice dropping to a murmur meant only for her. And maybe we could both stop being so damn lonely. Chase's hand moved to his gun belt, a gesture so subtle Rose almost missed it. Now hold on there, Beckett. You're talking about marrying a woman you've known less than a day. A woman with no family, no references, no. A woman, Beckett interrupted, who's shown more grace and strength in one morning than most folks manage in a lifetime. But as the words hung in the air, Rose noticed something that made her blood run cold. The way Chase's fingers lingered near his weapon, the calculating gleam in Athena's eyes, and the sudden realization that accepting Beckett's protection might put them all in more danger than she'd ever imagined. 3 days after Chase and Athena's visit, Rose stood in Beckett's vegetable garden, her hands deep in the rich Montana soil. The late afternoon sun warmed her shoulders as she worked, and she could hear the children's laughter from the pasture where they were helping Weston and Beckett repair fence posts. For the first time in months, she felt something approaching. Peace. That peace shattered when she found the note that it was pinned to the scarecrow with a rusted nail, the paper fluttering in the prairie wind like a dying bird. Rose's hands trembled as she unfolded it, her heart hammering against her ribs as she read the crude scrawl. Get out or face the consequences. Decent folk don't want your kind here. You have 3 days. Mama. Palmer's voice made her jump. The girl had approached silently, her young face creased with concern. What's that paper? Rose crumpled the note quickly, forcing a smile. Nothing important, sweetheart. Just a reminder about supplies from town. But Palmer was too sharp, too weathered by hardship to be fooled. Mama, you're scared. I can tell. Before Rose could respond, Beckett's voice carried across the yard. Rose, you need to see this. She found him in the barn, his face grim as he pointed to the far stall. Someone had slashed the leather on his best saddle, carved ugly words into the wooden beam, and scattered broken glass across the hay. The violence of it made Rose's stomach turn. When did this happen? She whispered. Sometime today, while we were all outside. Beckett's jaw was tight with controlled anger. They're trying to scare you away. They're succeeding, Rose admitted, sinking onto a hay bale. I found this in the garden. She handed him the crumpled note that Beckett's eyes darkened as he read. This is Chase's work. That coward's too yellow to face me man to man, so he's trying to frighten a woman and children. Why? Rose asked. What does he gain from us leaving? It's not about you, Beckett said quietly. It's about me. Chase has been circling my land like a vulture for 2 years, waiting for me to fail, to give up, to sell cheap. A man alone with grief might do that, but a man with a family to protect. He shook his head. That's a different kind of man entirely. So I've made you a target, Rose said, her voice hollow. No, Beckett said firmly, kneeling before her. You've made me remember what I'm fighting for. That evening, as Rose tucked the children into bed, she felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Stay and put them all in danger. Or leave and watch her children's hearts break all over again. Mama, Emery whispered as she kissed his forehead. Are we going to have to leave Mr. Beckett? I don't know, sweetheart. I don't want to, Palmer said fiercely. I like having a daddy again. And Weston needs us too. He was so sad before we came. Rose's throat tightened. Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to keep everyone safe. But Mr. Beckett keeps us safe, Emery insisted. He's strong and brave, and he makes good pancakes. After the children finally slept, Rose found Beckett on the porch, his rifle across his knees. The night air was cool and filled with the sound of crickets and distant coyotes. You don't have to stand guard, she said, settling beside him. Man's got to protect what's his, he replied simply. Am I yours, Beckett? The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she felt her cheeks burn in the darkness. He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. Do you want to be? Before she could answer, a new voice cut through the night. Well, ain't this cozy? They both spun to see a figure emerging from the shadows. But it wasn't Chase or Athena. It was a tall man with silver hair and a marshal's badge glinting on his vest. Rose felt her blood turn to ice. Marshal Sawyer, Beckett said carefully. Bit late for a social call. Not social. The marshal replied, his cold eyes fixed on Rose. Official business. Mrs. Brennan, I presume. Rose nodded, not trusting her voice. I've had some interesting correspondence about you, ma'am. Seems there's folks back east who've been looking for a certain Irish widow and her 3 children. Folks who are mighty anxious to have a conversation about some missing property. I don't know what you're talking about, Rose said, but her voice shook. Don't you? Marshal Sawyer pulled out a folded paper. Bank robbery in St. Louis. Witnesses describe a woman matching your description, traveling with children. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say, considering your husband's recent death? Beckett stood slowly, his hand moving to his own gun. You're saying Rose robbed a bank. I'm saying there's questions need answering, the marshal replied. Questions about how a poor widow afforded passage west, about why she's traveling under an assumed name, about what really happened to her husband. My name is Rose Brennan, she said desperately. My husband died of fever, and I never, your husband's name was Patrick O'Sullivan. The marshal interrupted. And he didn't die of fever. He died in a shootout with the law after trying to rob the First National Bank of St. Louis. You were his accomplice, Mrs. O'Sullivan. And those children? They're not all yours, are they?" The world tilted beneath Rose's feet. She felt Beckett's eyes on her, saw the confusion and dawning hurt in his expression. "That's not. I never," she whispered. "Palmer isn't your daughter," the marshal continued, relentlessly. "She's the daughter of the bank president you and your husband killed. You took her when you fled. That's kidnapping, Mrs. O'Sullivan. And murder. No." Rose's voice cracked. "Palmer is my daughter. I've raised her since you stole her from her real family," the marshal finished. "There's a reward for her safe return, and a rope waiting for you." Rose looked at Beckett, saw the shock and betrayal written across his face, and felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. Everything she'd built here, everything she'd begun to hope for, crumbled to dust. "Beckett," she whispered, "I can. Explain, can you?" His voice was cold as winter stone. "Can you explain why you lied to me? Why you brought a kidnapped child into my home? Why you made me care about you when it was all built on lies?" From inside the house came the sound of crying. Palmer, awakened by the raised voices, calling for her mama. The sound cut through Rose like a blade. "She is my daughter," Rose said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "I don't care what papers say or what names we used. I've loved her and raised her and protected her for 6 years. She's mine." "The law says different," Marshal Sawyer said, reaching for his handcuffs. "Rose O'Sullivan, you're under arrest for bank robbery, murder, and kidnapping. You're coming with me." But as the marshal stepped forward, the sound of children's voices drifted from the house. Not just Palmer crying, but Emery and even little Whitman joining in, all of them calling for their mama, and Rose realized that the truth about her past was nothing compared to the choice she was about to face: save herself or save the children who called her family. The marshal's handcuffs gleamed like snake eyes in the moonlight as he approached Rose. But before he could reach her, the sound of hoofbeats thundered across the prairie, fast, desperate, and growing closer by the second. "Marshal," a young deputy burst into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat. "Thank God I found you. We got word from the telegraph office. There's been developments in the O'Sullivan case." Marshal Sawyer's hand paused over his gun. "What kind of developments?" "Ellis, the real Rose O'Sullivan, is dead, sir. Has been for 2 years. Shot down in a saloon in Denver. Positive identification confirmed. And the bank president's daughter, they said, was kidnapped? She was found safe in Chicago 3 days ago, living with her grandmother." The silence that followed was deafening. Rose felt her legs give out, and she sank back onto the porch steps, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. "Then who is she?" Beckett asked, his voice raw with confusion. Deputy Ellis dismounted, pulling a worn photograph from his vest. "Near as we can tell, she's exactly who she says she is: Rose Brennan, widow of Patrick Brennan, who died of fever in Kansas." The resemblance to O'Sullivan's woman was just unfortunate coincidence. Rose looked up at Beckett, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to tell you. I am Rose Brennan. Palmer is my daughter, born to me and Patrick in County Cork before we came to America. Emery and Whitman are mine too, born in Kansas. I never robbed anyone, never killed anyone, never." But the name change, Marshal Sawyer interrupted, clearly reluctant to abandon his arrest. "Why were you traveling under?" "I wasn't," Rose said firmly. "Rose Brennan is my married name. My maiden name was O'Sullivan, same as half the Irish in America. That's the only connection to your bank robber." The marshal studied the photograph, then looked at Rose, his face grim. "Well, I'll be damned. You're right, Ellis. Bone structure's all wrong. Eyes too. I apologize, ma'am, but you understand. I understand that you nearly destroyed an innocent woman's life based on a name and a desperate man's assumptions," Beckett said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now the question is, who fed you those lies?" From the darkness came a slow clap. Chase Nolan stepped into the lamplight, his face twisted with rage and defeat. "Very touching reunion. Very convenient timing on that telegram." "Chase," Beckett said, his hand moving to his gun. "Should have known you were behind this. You think you're so smart, don't you?" Chase spat. "Both of you. Well, maybe the law won't take her, but I've got other ways of solving problems." Before anyone could react, Chase drew his pistol, but not at Beckett. At Rose. The shot rang out across the prairie like thunder, but it was Beckett who moved faster than lightning, throwing himself between Rose and the bullet. The impact spun him around, and he collapsed against the porch rail, blood spreading across his shirt. Beckett! Rose screamed, catching him as he fell. Chaos erupted. The marshal and deputy both drew their weapons, but Chase was already backing toward his horse, his gun still trained on Rose. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll burn this place to the ground before I let you have what's mine." But as he reached for his horse's reins, a small figure appeared in the doorway. Palmer, clutching Beckett's hunting rifle with determination beyond her years. "You shot our daddy," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "And I won't let you hurt my mama." The rifle was too big for her, but she held it with the fierce protectiveness of a mother bear. Behind her, Emery appeared with Weston, both boys armed with kitchen knives. "Palmer, no," Rose cried, but the girl's finger was already on the trigger. Chase laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think I'm afraid of children? I'll—" The rifle boomed, and Chase's hat flew off his head. Palmer had missed by inches, but the message was clear. These children had already lost one father. They wouldn't lose another without a fight. "Next one won't miss," Palmer said, working the bolt with shaking hands. "Daddy taught me to shoot. Before he died. Real daddy, not you." Chase's face went white. He looked at the children, at the marshal's drawn guns, at Rose cradling Beckett's bleeding form, and something in his expression shifted from rage to madness. "Fine," he hissed. "If I can't have this land, nobody can." He pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle from his saddlebag, and Rose's blood turned to ice as she recognized the distinctive smell of dynamite. "Chase, don't be a fool," Marshal Sawyer warned. "You'll kill us all." "That's the idea," Chase replied, striking a match, starting with the woman who ruined everything. But as he lit the fuse, Athena Booker emerged from the darkness behind him. Her face was pale but determined, and in her hand was a derringer that gleamed silver in the moonlight. "I won't let you do this, Chase," she said quietly. "I loved you, but I won't be party to murder." "Athena." Chase turned, confusion replacing madness. "What are you?" "I'm choosing what's right over what's easy," she said, and pulled the trigger. The shot took Chase high in the shoulder, spinning him around. The lit dynamite flew from his hands, arcing through the air toward the barn where it would detonate among the hay and livestock. Beckett, despite his wound, somehow found the strength to move. He rolled away from Rose, drew his pistol, and fired 3 times in rapid succession. The bundle exploded in midair, 50 feet from any building, the flash lighting up the night like a fallen star. When the smoke cleared, Chase lay unconscious. In the dirt, Marshal Sawyer stood over him with handcuffs, and Athena was quietly weeping into her hands. "Why?" Rose asked her. "Why help us?" Athena looked up, her perfect composure finally cracked. "Because I saw what love looks like tonight. Real love. And I realized I'd rather lose the man I thought I loved than watch him destroy the family that actually knows what love means." Rose turned back to Beckett, who was struggling to sit up despite the blood seeping through his shirt. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough to need doctoring," he admitted. "But not bad enough to stop me from saying something that should have been said days ago." "What's that?" Beckett reached for her hand, his eyes never leaving her face. "Rose Brennan. I don't care what your name was before, or what mistakes you think you've made. I love you. I love your children. I love the way you make this house feel like home, and I love the way you make me feel like the man I used to be." "Beckett, let me finish," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I know this is fast, and I know it's crazy, but life's too short and too dangerous for slow courtship. Marry me, Rose. Make this real. Make us a family." Rose looked at Palmer, who was nodding eagerly, at Emery and Weston grinning through their tears, at baby Whitman reaching for Beckett with chubby hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." But as she leaned down to kiss him, she saw something that made her heart stop. A second figure moving in the shadows beyond the barn, and the glint of metal in his hand. Chase had a partner, and he was moving toward the house where the children slept. With only minutes before he discovered they were all outside and defenseless, the shadow moving toward the house belonged to Booker Ellis. Not Deputy Ellis, but Athena's uncle, the banker who'd been quietly financing Chase's schemes. Rose realized with crystal clarity that the man who'd been trying to drive them away wasn't just after Beckett's land. He wanted the water rights that came with it, rights worth a fortune to the railroad companies pushing west. Get the children. Inside, Beckett whispered urgently, struggling to his feet despite his wound. Now. But Palmer, still clutching the rifle, shook her head fiercely. We don't run anymore, Mama. We're home now. She's right, Weston said, standing shoulder to shoulder with his new sister. This is our land, our family. We fight for it. Rose's heart swelled with fierce pride and terror as Ellis emerged from the shadows, his banker's suit incongruous, with the gun in his hand. Behind him, two more men materialized, hired guns with cold eyes and ready weapons. Well, Ellis called out, his cultured voice carrying easily across the yard. Quite the little drama you've staged here. But I'm afraid the show's over. Uncle Ellis. Athena stared at him in shock. What are you doing here? Cleaning up your boyfriend's mess. Ellis replied coldly. Chase was supposed to handle this quietly. Drive them off, buy the land cheap, deed the water rights to the railroad. Simple business. But no, he had to make it personal. Marshal Sawyer stepped forward, his badge glinting in the lamplight. Booker Ellis, you're under arrest for conspiracy and attempted murder. Ellis laughed, a sound like coins clinking in a vault. With what evidence, Marshal? My word against a wounded rancher and a desperate widow? I think not. With this evidence, came a new voice from the darkness. Everyone turned to see a slight figure stepping into the light, the telegraph operator from town, holding a sheaf of papers. Been listening to your communications with the railroad, Mr. Ellis. Recording every bribe, every threat, every illegal transaction. The territorial government's been investigating railroad corruption for months. Ellis's face went white. Impossible. Those lines were secure. Nothing secure from a man whose daughter was killed in a railroad accident caused by shoddy construction. The operator replied. I've been waiting 2 years to catch you criminals. The banker's composure cracked entirely. Kill them all, he snarled to his hired guns. No witnesses. What happened next unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of violence and love. Palmer fired the rifle again, this time finding her mark in one gunman's shoulder. Beckett, moving. Despite his wound, drew and fired twice, dropping the second gunman. Marshal Sawyer's shot took Ellis in the leg, sending him sprawling, but it was Rose who delivered the final blow. As Ellis tried to crawl toward a dropped weapon, she stepped calmly over and placed her boot firmly on his wrist. That's for threatening. My children, she said quietly. And this is for thinking a mother wouldn't fight to protect her family. She pressed down just hard enough to make him cry out, then stepped back as the marshal moved in with handcuffs. 3 months later, the autumn air carried the scent of apple blossoms and fresh bread as Rose stood in her kitchen, truly her kitchen now, preparing breakfast for her family. The scar on Beckett's shoulder had healed to a thin white line, and the children's nightmares had faded into memory. Mama, Palmer called from the doorway. The preacher's here for the ceremony. Rose smoothed her blue dress, the finest sheet ever owned, sewn from fabric Beckett had ordered special from Denver, and took a deep breath. Through the window, she could see their guests gathering in the garden. Neighbors who'd rallied around them after the truth came out. Athena Booker, who'd become an unlikely friend, even Marshal Sawyer and his wife. The wedding was small but perfect. Palmer scattered rose petals from the bushes that had finally begun to bloom again after years of neglect. Emery and Weston stood as ring bearers, their faces scrubbed and serious. Baby Whitman babbled happily in Deputy Ellis's arms. The young lawman had proven himself a friend and frequent visitor. When Beckett took Rose's hands before the preacher, his voice was steady and sure. I promise to love your children as my own, to protect this family with my life, and to never let a day pass without showing you how grateful I am that you chose to stay. Rose's voice was equally firm through her tears. I promise to make this house a home, to stand beside you through every storm, and to love you with the same fierce devotion you've shown my children. Our children, Beckett corrected gently, and Rose's heart overflowed as they kissed to seal their vows. The sound of children's laughter mixed with the wind through the cottonwoods, and for the first time in years, the silence that had haunted Beckett's ranch was filled with the music of belonging. 6 months later, As spring painted the Montana territory in shades of green and gold, Rose stood in the same garden where she'd found that threatening note. But now she was watching Palmer teach baby Whitman to walk while Emery and Weston chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. Beckett appeared beside her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Rose thought of that first night, when three exhausted children had called a stranger daddy and changed all their lives forever. She thought of the fear and danger they'd faced, the love they'd found, the family they'd built, from pieces of broken hearts. "Only one," she said, turning in his arms. "What's that?" "That it took us so long to find each other." In the distance, a new foal nickered softly to its mother, and roses bloomed wild and free along the fence line, their petals carrying on the wind like promises of tomorrow. The silence was gone forever, replaced by something far more precious, the sound of home. Well now, if that doesn't warm your heart like a cup of coffee on a cold morning, I don't know what will. Love has a way of finding us when we least expect it and most need it, just like it found Beckett and Rose and those precious children. If this tale of courage and second chances touched your heart, give it a like and let me know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love conquering all odds in the Wild West. Speaking of comments, I'm mighty curious. Where in this big, beautiful world are you watching from today? Drop me a line and let me know what corner of the earth this story reached.